मराठीमध्ये असं म्हणतात की प्रत्येकजण स्वतःसाठी जगतो, पण स्वतःसाठी जगत असताना जो दुसऱ्यासाठी काही करतो त्याचं आयुष्य खऱ्या अर्थाने सार्थकी लागलं. त्याचप्रमाणे आपण आपले बाकीचे विषय शिकत असताना ह्यूमन राईट्स हा सब्जेक्ट या युनिव्हर्सिटीने जो इंट्रोड्यूस केलेला आहे तो सब्जेक्ट पूर्ण इंटरेस्ट घेऊन तो सब्जेक्ट शिकावा आणि त्याबरोबरच आपले बाकीचे जे सब्जेक्ट्स आहेत, फिजिक्स आहे, बायोलॉजी आहे किंवा ज्या ज्या काही स्ट्रीम लाईन्स असतील ते सब्जेक्ट शिकावे. बट द ह्यूमन राईट्स एज्युकेशन प्लीज गिव्ह टॉप प्रायोरिटी to this subject. I am really happy to learn that the Pune University is the first university to introduce this human rights education to all the students studying in the university. This is something creditable and perhaps milestone in the history of the Pune University. Maybe this subject is very vast, human rights, and I will be addressing, I have divided it in 4 parts. First is how that human rights education and human rights are developed all over world. Second, where these human rights finds place in the Indian Constitution and laws. Third, how the Supreme Court, by pronouncing various judgments, have given true and practical meaning to those human rights. And fourth, the area where the students are required to concentrate after taking the education of the human rights. Therefore, this is a very serious subject, vast subject, and then really this requires patience to learn and to hear this subject. Now, what are these human rights? Naturally, question will arise in the mind that what is mean by human rights? Now, the importance of human rights education is not only recognized in our country but all over the world. Human rights are those rights which inherent in every human being by virtue of being a person. So, if you want to trace the origin of the human rights, it starts from the human civilization or maybe 4,000 years back. These rights are nothing but modern name of what had been traditionally known as natural rights, that is rights bestowed upon the human beings by nature. Human rights are fundamental to our very existence, without which we cannot live as human beings. One of the author in his book has defined human rights as man's natural rights created by natural law. All human rights are derived from the innate worth and dignity of human beings. Major world religions had also developed noble ideas concerning humanism, human rights, and world peace. One of the author describes in his book that Buddhism preaches non-violence is the greatest virtue. Hinduism preaches a person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of material desires that enter like rivers into ocean, which is ever being filled but is always still, can alone achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desire. Islam preaches cooperate with one another in righteous and piety and do not cooperate in sin and transgression. Jainism preaches all men should live in peace with their fellow being. This is the Lord's desire. Therefore, it is not that these human rights is something new to the Indian civilization and world civilization. Human welfare and human dignity has evolved along with the evolution of the state system and of the process of organizing the international system of states. The human civilization has always had concern for human rights throughout the history. Even though the powerful groups in each community sought to take benefit from using their position more than others. Ancient civilization such as the Indian have had a worldview of human welfare. The year 1945 saw the birth of the United Nations. Soon thereafter followed the United Nations Charter, which contained again all that was necessary, all that was required for the purpose of seeing that peace prevails in the world. 56 nations came together to consider the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even then, 48 countries responded and accepted the resolution, yet did not. However, beginning was made, and on 10th of December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. The very first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights relates to equality of people, equality of human beings all over the world. Each person is equal as the other. That is the basic doctrine. Seventh article provides for equality before law. All men and women are born equal and have the right to live in dignity. Various other human rights are also incorporated in the said declaration, which includes the right to liberty, right to freedom, right to free speech, right to movement, right to social amenities, right to food, and right to privacy, and so on. In 1966, two other declarations followed. The number of economic, social, and cultural rights have come to be elaborated and formulated following Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants. Although the principle of self-determination has been mentioned in the United Nations Charter, the United Nations became actively engaged in formulating this principle and seeing its implementation only by 1960. That year, the General Assembly adopted a declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and people. The General Assembly adopted in 1970 a declaration on principles of international law embodying formulation of 7 basic principles of international law known as the Friendly Relations Declaration. One of these is the principle of self-determination. The doctrine reaffirms aspects of the people formulated in 1960 declaration. Freedom from discrimination based on race, color, creed, language, etc. is recognized in Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants. In 1963, the General Assembly adopted a declaration on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. It reaffirmed, among other things, that all forms of racial discrimination were violation of fundamental human rights. Said declaration was soon followed by an international convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination adopted by the General Assembly in 1965, and in 1987 the General Assembly adopted a declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on region or belief. Equal rights of men and women and freedom from discrimination on ground of sex, among other grounds, are proclaimed by Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well as the international covenants. In United Nations, the General Assembly adopted Convention on Political Rights of Women in 1952 and another on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women in 1979. This seeks to ensure equality between men and women. Besides this, the General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Nationality of Married Women in 1957 to recognize women's right to nationality, and the Convention of Consent to Marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriage in 1962. The right to work has been stressed not only in Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants, but also in various other instruments, including the Convention Against All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Convention on Discrimination Against Women. The ILO Employment Policy Convention 1964 and 1984 recommendations on employment policy, the Discrimination, Employment and Occupation Convention 1958 and the recommendation of 1958 under the convention also have a direct bearing on the right to work. Following Universal Declaration of Human Rights and covenants, the 1965 Racial Discrimination Convention and the 1979 Convention on Discrimination Against Women stress the principle of non-discrimination in education. The Constitution of the World Health Organization claims that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without discrimination. Right to adequate food, right to adequate shelter and services, right to culture, right to clear environment, right to development are also considered at international level, and time to time steps are taken to address those rights. The important aspect of the right to life, liberty and security of persons evolved through United Nations activities have been the issue of abolition of capital punishment, summary or arbitrary executions, hostage taking, international terrorism and the nuclear arms race. Steps are also taken to abolish slavery, freedom from arbitrary detention. United Nations had taken effective steps to redress the rights of vulnerable groups of persons, which includes right of the child, right of ethnic, religious or linguistic minorities, right of indigenous peoples, right of migrant workers, right of disabled persons, and so on. There is also international implementation machinery created at the international level for implementing such rights throughout the world. Now, apart from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, in 1989 the General Assembly also adopted Declaration on the Rights of Child, which contains 54 articles. a much awaited outcome of Association of Southeast Asian Nations commitment to human rights in 2012 will be the finalization of an Asian instrument on human rights, particularly in the form of Human Rights Declaration. Therefore, my friends, human rights are recognized throughout the world and effective steps are being taken to implement those rights in true spirit. One eminent American constitutional lawyer, Lawrence Tribe, has said, and I quote, "The basic human needs must be taken not as window dressing, but as a window into the decision-making process," unquote. So far, recognition of human rights and its implementation in our country is concerned, Part 3 of the Constitution of India contains almost everything that is there in the Human Rights Declaration, and what could not be brought within the chapter of fundamental rights has been included in Part 4 of the Constitution, which deals with directive principles of state policy for the purpose of good governance. But they are all more or less reflected. Subsequently, Article 51A was introduced in Part 4 of the Constitution, which is about fundamental duties of the citizens, and there really question comes whether only the government authorities or the persons who are in the administration, they are only responsible for protection of the human rights, or all the citizens are responsible to maintain and protect the human rights and to discharge their duties. Right to education now finds place in Article 21A of the Constitution. Right to education is one of the fundamental principles included in the Declaration of Human Rights. The judicial review is an essential component of the rule of law, which is a basic feature of the Indian Constitution. In Nilabati Behera versus State of Orissa, the Supreme Court, while considering the question of grant of relief in a case of custodial death of the son of the petitioner, opined that the old doctrine of only relegating the aggrieved to the remedies available in civil law limits the role of the courts to much as the protector and guarantor of the indefeasible human rights of the citizens, and went on to say that the courts have an obligation to satisfy the social aspirations of the citizens because the courts and the law are for the people and expected to respond to their aspirations. The court, therefore, in that case, molded the relief by granting compensation by way of penalizing the wrongdoer and fixing the liability to the public wrong on the state which failed in its public duty to protect human rights of the citizen. It was stressed that a public body or officials should not act unlawfully and should perform their public duties in accordance with law. This was done by the court in exercise of its public law jurisdiction. The court explained the purpose of public law and said that the purpose of public law is not only to civilize public power, but also to assure to the citizen that they live under a legal system which aims to protect and preserve the rule of law. Thus, new tools were invented to give redress to the citizens. The Supreme Court in Maneka Gandhi's case pronounced that the procedure contemplated by Article 21 must be right, just, and fair, and not arbitrary. It must pass the test of reasonableness, and the procedure should be in conformity with the principles of natural justice, and unless it was so, it would be no procedure at all, and the requirement of Article 21 would not be satisfied. Yet in another case, in case of Bandhua Mukti Morcha, the Supreme Court reiterated once again that right to life guaranteed by Article 21 of the Constitution included the right to live with human dignity free from exploitation. Yet in another case, in case of Mohini Jain, the Supreme Court held the right to free education to the children until they complete the age of 14 years also to be a fundamental right by taking note of Article 45 of the Constitution. In case of NH Oscott, the Supreme Court held that Supreme Court recognized the right of indigent person to have legal aid. This is very important right and landmark judgment of the Supreme Court, which gives relief to crores of people of this country and really gives access to the justice, because it provides for legal aid if any litigant, if he is not able to afford the expenses and engage the lawyer in the court, he can certainly approach the legal aid committee which are established in the courts, and then the courts and the legal aid committee will appoint lawyer for that litigant. The courts have been making judicial intervention in cases concerning violation of human rights as an ongoing judicial process. Decisions on such matters as the right to protection against solitary confinement, as in Sunil Batra, the right not to be held in fetters, as in Shobraj case, the right against handcuffing, as in T. Vetiswaran case, the right against custodial violence, as in Nilavati Behra's case, or the rights of the arrestee, as in D.K. Basu's case, or right of female employees not to be sexually harassed at the places of work, as in the case of Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan, are just a few pointers in that direction. In Doon Valley case, the Supreme Court held that Article 21 included in its sweep a right to clean environment, and that the permanent assets of mankind cannot be allowed to be exhausted in our generation. In Olema gas leak case, the Supreme Court held that the rule of strict liability was applied without exception to a polluting undertaking employing hazardous process of manufacture. There are many other judgments in which the Supreme Court has given true meaning and practical interpretation to the human rights. Recently, the bench presided over by the Honorable the Chief Justice of India in one matter held right to livelihood is an integral part of the right to life under Article 21, although it has not been incorporated by specific language in Part 3 by the framers of the Constitution. Therefore, the courts, the Supreme Court and also High Courts, are taking keen interest and efforts to see that these human rights are really implemented and protected in its true spirit, so as to give benefit to the citizens of this country. There are various welfare legislations which are passed by the states and central government. The protection and implementation of the human rights with all its rigor and seriousness is necessary in our country. We have more than 3,000 castes, subcastes, religions, tribes. When we move from one place to another, we find that way of life, habits of people, language, etc. is different from region to region. Sizable section of the society is not aware about their rights due to lack of education, poverty, unemployment, and so on. Sometimes there are very good policies, however, proper implementation of those policies is lacking. There are inadequate financial resources and considerable population of the country is below poverty line. Roughly around 70% population resides in rural area and dependent upon agricultural production, and therefore, though rights are conferred and guaranteed by the Constitution and various other legislations, awareness about such rights and corresponding duties is required to be undertaken so as to make people aware about their rights and also duties. In many parts of India, due to lack of education, people are not aware about their rights. For example, people living in forest areas, tribal areas, remote areas, and hilly areas are certain examples where people are not aware about their rights and duties. Their rights and there is no proper machinery to make them aware about their rights and to educate them. Though there is a sincere desire on the part of the central government and state governments to give education to remote places, the main difficulty being faced in that is that educated youths are not easily ready to go in those areas for serving in the school, and also infrastructure and facilities are not adequate. Therefore, the human rights education becomes important for two reasons. Firstly, the students will learn about citizens' human rights and also duties, and after taking such education will serve the nation by creating awareness in oppressed and illiterate classes of the society. Though the important rights are recognized and given, which include the right to good health, right to education, right to good environment, right to freedom of speech and expression, and other rights, right to move from one place to another. However, citizens are not fully aware about their rights. There are many areas where we can find violation of human rights. However, there is no readily available redressal machinery. Therefore, many citizens have to suffer. Take an example. If ordinary citizen wants to lodge a complaint to the police station or police department, sometimes their complaints are not accepted or not reduced into writing. In some cases, there is no proper investigation. In some states, low-ranking officers are conferred power of arrest and search, like in Jammu and Kashmir, which is often misused by them. Though the right to primary education is now recognized as fundamental right, however, many people living in remote areas are not aware about their right to education. There are other sections of society, for example, laborers who are engaged on agricultural field for harvesting and transporting sugarcane. Those activities are seasonal in nature. Obviously, the question would arise in mind about what happens to their children's education. All these issues are required to be seriously addressed. There are other sections of the society, including destitute women, children from the broken families, what happens to the human rights of under trials, prisoners, if they are not brought before the court on the date fixed by the court? What happens to the victims of the international terrorism, victims of war, victims of riots? Therefore, these are the issues the students who will be taking education of human rights will have to concentrate, and after taking education will have to render their services to the nation. Therefore, the step taken by this university to introduce the subject of human rights education to all students is most important, and